Wild animals can surprise us so much. A wounded mother bear carried her dying cub to this man. What he did next is incredible. Richard, who had built most of his house himself, was in the midst of building the porch on a quiet day. He turned around to grab a nail and nearly jumped out of his skin. A massive brown bear stood right in front of him. He had seen bears in the wild before, let alone face to face, but never a bloody and injured one. This indicated potential danger. What shocked Richard even more was the sight of the bear holding a dying cub between its powerful claws. At first, Richard wasn't sure if the big bear had harmed the cub, but as he looked closer and aimed his loaded weapon at the bear, he noticed that the cub was caught in a bear trap and looked severely injured. It was a terribly bloody scene, but Richard was accustomed to such situations. As a retired fighter, he had seen and treated worse injuries before. When his military career ended, he remained with a longing for a peaceful place where he could decompress and relax. He knew that the wildlife around him thrived, but he could never have imagined that he would come so close to them, let alone that the mother would also be injured. He imagined that her injuries might have occurred in the attempt to free the cub, but it seemed impossible to approach them to examine the injuries. He was faced with a great challenge. How could he help them? Why had the mother come to him? Was she really seeking his assistance, or would she attack him as soon as he moved? He pondered how to approach the bears to see if he could help them, but it seemed far-fetched. Even if he managed to reach the little cub without being devoured by its mother, he knew how fragile young bears were. He wanted to help them, but he couldn't take any risks because the mother bear kept growling at him, looking at her bear cub she had set down and nudging the cub towards Richard over and over. It was clear that she was asking for help. What he did next was incredible. Perhaps he should have sought safety inside the house. Just because the bear seemed to be asking for help, it didn't change the fact that this situation could be seriously dangerous. Nevertheless, he looked at the dying cub and made the decision to act. As Richard approached the cub, the mother bear retreated as if she understood that he needed some space. The bear emitted mournful sounds as if her heart were breaking. Richard couldn't help but feel deep compassion for her. He rushed inside, called the animal rescue, and fetched a first aid kit. Then he left the house and returned outside to the cub, which had already lost so much blood. He wasn't sure if they would arrive in time. He had to do what he could. He lifted the cub and carefully opened the bear trap. There was a terrible noise, and for a moment he feared the mother bear would attack, thinking he might harm the cub. But she sat motionless, waiting for him to do something. Once the trap was released, blood oozed from the wounds, forming a pool beneath. He needed to stop the bleeding, or he would be lost long before anyone could come to their aid. The cub had stopped moving. It seemed unconscious. Richard's hands were stained with blood. He cleaned the wounds, stitched them up, and applied a bandage. She was quickly turning red from the blood, but what he had done seemed to stem the bleeding. At the same time, the mother bear didn't look well, and he wished he could examine her to make sure she was okay. Seeing her in pain before his eyes was awful, but she wasn't the tiny baby he had just cared for. And he couldn't just approach her and help. He worried. She groaned softly and appeared to be suffering. She also swayed from side to side. She was in trouble, and there was nothing Richard could do about it. Everything in him told him to try to help her. Yet he couldn't get too close to her, and he also had to think about his own safety. He was fully occupied with the cub. He couldn't feel its heartbeat anymore. He began resuscitation, attempting to breathe life into the small body. Hope was fading, then suddenly it got even worse. The mother bear also collapsed, just sitting there and slumping to the side. Richard's heart sank and fear gripped him, but he pressed on, trying to save both of them. Yet now he could see all the good slipping through his fingers, and there was nothing he could do. It was either a lack of sufficient help or the right medical care for such a large animal. Richard was already desperate when he suddenly heard vehicles. He had never been so grateful to see the animal rescue and wildlife rescue team. The bears had awakened again, but all the noise frightened them. They didn't know where to run. Should they try to flee or stay put? The little bear cub could barely stand on its feet. He continued the cardiopulmonary resuscitation while the team approached him, waiting for the cub to fall asleep. The adrenaline it felt kept it awake longer than it should have, but eventually it fell asleep and the wounds could be examined. Yet Richard had managed to stop most of the bleeding. As they took the cub away, its heart was beating again. Richard had brought it back. Now they had to make sure it stayed that way. As the team took him, they immediately administered fluids and oxygen. Richard took the time to check on the mother bear, who had no idea how to thank him for bringing her cub. But now she was in a terrible state. She had a severe wound and had lost a lot of blood. They had no idea how she got it. It could have been another trap she had stumbled into. Either way, both bears needed to be transported to the wildlife sanctuary. The vet said both would require surgery. Richard was exhausted as the bears were loaded and driven away. He took some time to shower. Seeing all the blood on his arms and shirt, he doubted the cub would survive. Richard rushed to the hospital to check on the bears. The cub was still in surgery, the trap had caused extensive damage and they needed to repair it. A difficult recovery lay ahead. The mother bear was in better condition. In the next few days, things remained uncertain. The cub came out of surgery, but they weren't sure if it would make it. Richard spent most of his time at the rescue station. One night, Richard slept soundly next to the cub's cage. Then something went wrong. The baby cried out and its condition seemed strange. It was awake but couldn't focus. Then the cub started convulsing. Something was seriously wrong. If Richard hadn't been there, no one might have noticed it was deteriorating. The stitches tore and it started to bleed. It was a major setback, but slowly it started to improve again. Unfortunately, the same couldn't be said for its mother. The mother bear was not doing well. She was weak, and after contracting an infection in her wound, it got even worse. But that wasn't the worst part. They could tend to her wounds, but they struggled with her depression. As her wounds began to heal, she was moved to a large enclosure with plenty of room to play. However, she just sat in a corner and didn't move. She had no interest in eating, and everyone was deeply concerned. Richard believed the mother bear thought she had lost her cub. Then he decided to do the next best thing. He had an idea that might help her. The cub was much better, but they still administered medicine to him. They couldn't bring him to his mother. Richard hoped that seeing her would help. At first, she didn't react, but then she lifted her head and saw that he was holding the cub. She jumped up and ran to the fence, standing upright and smelling the cub through the barrier. Richard could see the moment she realized it was her cub. Her whole body perked up. Suddenly, she made joyful noises rolling around in her enclosure, and from then on, she was much happier. She started eating again and even swam in the small pond in her enclosure. The baby was also doing better, and it didn't take long before they could be reunited. As his wound began to heal, they brought the cub back to his mother. It was a wonderful reunion. The mother bear embraced her cub and they played together.